So something amazing is happening, and for once I have good news. While we are all focused on the Middle East, something game-changing is happening in the Indo-Pacific. Australia and China are now coming together and writing a new chapter. And this is an economic victory for both countries and a strategic defeat for the United States. The old US playbook of divide and conquer isn't working very well in 2023. In our lead story today, we have a tale of overcoming differences and countries doing what's best for themselves. China and Australia look for mutual benefit after years of animosity. Australia's Albanese met with President Xi on his first visit Beijing since 2016, and this will pay huge dividends. It's like the Aussies suddenly had an epiphany and realized that, hey, what are we doing? It doesn't make sense to torpedo our own economy. China is our largest trading partner. And listen to what Xi Jinping said during the meeting, that the two countries had no fundamental conflict of interest and could become mutually trusting and successful partners. And this is a big step since relations went to hell during the term of Scott Morrison. Australia was the first country to ban Huawei from their 5G network, which came as a complete shock. Another example was the government blocking a Chinese fund from investing in a rare earth producer. Canberra blocked the bid of a China-linked investment into their mineral supply chain on the grounds of national interest. It was restrictions like this that caused China to slowly divest away from Australia, right? Why put your money to a country where you're not welcome? Might as well invest in the BRICS countries like Russia or the Middle East. And things got so bad that Chinese corporate investment in Australia fell 5 years in a row. It went from over $11 billion in 2016 to under 600 million by 2021, which is an insane drop. Investment dropped by over 90%, which has impacted the Australian economy. In a story by ABC, Chinese investment is crucial to Australia's energy transition. They're trying to build new renewable energy networks, including solar panels, wind towers, and batteries. But there's a big problem. You need a ton of raw materials. While Australia is the world's biggest supplier of lithium for batteries, to retain that spot, they need to develop more mines. Over 400 new mines globally will be needed just to supply EVs with batteries. But developing mines takes a lot of money, expertise, and risk taking. And this isn't your average venture. This is where Chinese investments comes in. This is money that isn't afraid of taking risks. In 2022, mining accounted for 86% of China's investment flows into Australia. That is going to projects like lithium mines, and this is exactly what Australia needs to remain the top exporter of renewable commodities. And that's why China and Australia are natural trading and economic partners. But why did this take so long? Well, maybe it's because of the influence of the G7. And we know the rhetoric from the US and the UK is centered around decoupling or de-risking from China, right? It framed China as the world's enemy, ready to eat up the Indo-Pacific. Take this headline from CNN, for example. Australia, the UK, and the US are joining forces in the Pacific, but will nuclear subs arrive quick enough to counter China? And it's this kind of fear-mongering that made Australia listen to the US. It kind of shows some kind of grand plan to deter an attack from China that's imminent. They believed and they peddled the strategic interests of the US, which mainly benefited, guess who? The United States itself. And this is where we need to talk about that AUKUS nuclear sub deal. That was a great economic victory for the US, but a huge financial drain for Australia. The former Prime Minister of Australia, Paul Keating, called the submarine pact the worst deal in all of history. According to him, it's the worst international decision and called it seriously unwise. But here's where things get really interesting. He revealed the true intentions of the deal, which was to preserve US hegemony in East Asia. Listen to this. Albany screwed into place the last shackle in the long chain which the Americans have laid out to contain China, and that the great sin China committed in the eyes of the West was developing its economy to equal the size of the United States. Keating revealed the true intentions of all this China decoupling or containment talk. It's basically to ensure America stays the unchallenged number one superpower in the world. But let's analyze how much the AUKUS deal will cost the Australian government. The program is going to cost Australia up to $368 billion over the next 3 decades. That's a lot of money. It will be used to buy 8 US Virginia-class nuclear submarines built by General Dynamics in the United States. So we can already see the big beneficiary of this deal. It will be the US. The big question is, what will this cost Australia financially? Because if you spend $360 billion on nuclear subs, That is money being taken away from other parts of the economy. It's a zero-sum game. So let's put the submarine spending in context. This chart shows us what other things Australia could spend the money on. This is using the lower bound of 270 billion Australian dollars, and the figures here have been converted to USD as well. In the first decade, Australia is expected to spend at least 58 billion US dollars on the deal. That is almost half the budget for transport infrastructure and almost all of school funding. But it gets crazier. $58 billion would be enough to raise the carer payment, Medicare rebate, and rent assistance all at the same time. So it's a huge burden to spend money to defend yourself against a visible enemy who is your biggest trading partner. You'll also be aggravating China, which is very counterproductive. This is money that could be used to build up the Australian economy. And the only beneficiary of this will be the US military industrial complex. Those are the true winners. The AUKUS deal enriches the US financially and enhances their Indo-Pacific presence. So in a way, from the American perspective, it is a very smart move. But things are changing. It's important to understand the significance of Albany's trip to Beijing. It's been 50 years since the first visit by Australian PM to China, and this shows a big reset of relations, especially from Australia. Albanese is taking a very practical approach with China, and it's all about developing his economy. Australia and China will always have differences, but the main agenda here is to cooperate and build up each other's economies. And how can Australia benefit from China? The answer is very simple: enhance trade with Beijing when the rest of the West is starting to back away. Chinese exports fell by 25% to the United States in the first 6 months of 2023. This is much more than a global slowdown. It's a deliberate decoupling from Washington. And this is where Australia wins. China exports deflation because their goods are becoming cheaper as the dollar strengthens, while Australia has an inflation problem going on right now. We can see Australia's CPI rate is still astoundingly high compared to the US, Europe, and even Germany. It is at 5.4% in September and up by 1.2% from the previous quarter. The longer inflation persists, the RBA has to raise interest rates even higher. And we said before that Australia has to hike rates because inflation is far from over. And guess what? The RBA has hiked rates by 25 basis points to 4.35%. According to Bullock, inflation in Australia has passed its peak, but it is still too high and is proving to be more persistent than expected a few months ago. This is where improving trade with China comes in. The key here is to drive more trade with China. When Australia sells more stuff to China, they invoice in either US dollars or Australian dollars. And since the Fed started its rate hikes, the Australian dollar has crashed by at least 12% to the dollar. And this makes global imports to Australia more expensive because almost everything is still priced in the reserve currency. It is a direct contributor to their inflation crisis. And that's why trade with China is beneficial to the Australian dollar, right? If China pays in USD, Australia now has a bigger pile of greenbacks to prop up their local currency. Conversely, if it's bilateral trade and China pays in Australian dollars, it'll directly benefit Australia as well. There'll be more demand for the Aussie buck to buy commodities. So either way, it's a win-win proposition. And because of the previous trade curbs, there are now a ton of revenue to play catch up with. Australia eyes 3 lost years of commodity sales to China. From 2020 to 2022, the export revenue affected total $31 billion, which is a huge amount lost. Australia is an export-based economy. They need to sell their coal, iron ore, and food exports to other countries. And the biggest buyer in Asia Pacific is China. There's no point shipping stuff all the way to the West because it just increases the buying costs. And just take a look at the fall of coal and copper exports to Beijing. It took a big tumble over the past 3 years. Australia lost up to $12 billion a year of revenue from China at the peak. And this was money just next door. So if Australia mends ties with China, we'll see export levels of commodities start to recover. And this helps to keep inflation in check. So it's good economics for China and Australia to just work together, right? But there's an even bigger reason why countries love working with China. Well, it's because China is non-interventionist. They are all about business and they couldn't care less about how you run your country, which is a big departure from what the US does. The US playbook ties economic interest to their foreign policy, but China is different. They just want to trade and make money. And this is why China managed to broker the Iran-Saudi deal that restored diplomatic ties. And here's why these two rivals decided to accept China's deal to restore relations. The agreement affirmed the respect for sovereignty of states and the non-interference in internal affairs of states. The same goes for how China conducts their economic affairs. Australia partnering with China will also make it easier for them to sell more exports to the rest of BRICS as well. By 2024, BRICS will consist of 11 members, and additional 6 members are expected to join the bloc. In total, they represent almost 30% of global GDP, and in terms of purchasing power parity, they have already exceeded the G7. If you look at the list carefully, you can also see a lot of these countries are developing nations. These are places that need a ton of commodity imports like coal, iron ore, and food, stuff that Australia can export. So, by engaging with China more, Australia will likely find even more opportunities to trade with the rest of the BRICS nations. It's geographically closer than exporting stuff all the way to Europe, right? You can sell more for less. So, if we look at Australia's balance of trade, it's obvious how much money they are earning with China. Beijing isn't just their biggest trade partner, but a cash cow for Australia. In September 2023, China exported only 6.6 billion to Australia. In contrast, they imported over $12 billion worth of stuff from down under. So China's negative trade balance of 5.6 billion is Australia's trade surplus, which is very important for a net exporter country. Having a bigger surplus means a country becomes richer. They can add more money to their reserves or use it for social programs like rent assistance and disability. So the more Australia trades with China, the more stuff they sell, the stronger their economy will become. Even though China imposed trade curbs back in 2020, their imports from Australia are still strong thanks to iron ore demand. But with trade relations warming, we can expect to see the tariff of block goods exports start to rise. And this means by 2025, unless we have a global recession, Australia's exports to China could increase by 5%, 10%, or even 20% above the baseline. This helps them bring inflation down and even escape a potential recession. So it's quite a positive sign for Australia if relations improve. And we can see the different approaches countries are having with China, right? What's funny is how Europe is decoupling from Beijing, leaving more opportunities for Australia. Take Germany for example. Their economy is shrinking, with GDP falling by 0.1% in the previous quarter. They don't have access to cheap energy, and they are trying to cut away exports from China. And what does this insanity do? It destroys competitiveness. German products simply cost too much to manufacture, which means consumers have to pay more. Well, they won't pay more during a recession. However, Australia is taking a different approach. They are working with China because it benefits their economy, plain and simple. By exporting to Beijing, they earn more money, and by importing from China, they get cheaper products. They actually import deflation. So Albanese realizes the obvious that there's no good reason to decouple. During a press conference, he said this: China is a market of 1.4 billion people. It is an economy that's growing faster than the global average, and this is an economy that's complementary in many ways to the Australian economy. So there are wins to be had. Even though Australia might be having some headwinds right now, long term, it is looking rather bullish for them. And this might be the single best decision made by a Western country in 2023. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Will Australia start trading more with China? And has the US lost this fight? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.